It is my pleasure to welcome everyone, including all of our ISM members and guests, to our program today, hosted by ISM New Jersey. Today, our speakers will be discussing risk, stress, and resiliency. We would like to hear from you today, so please be sure to put any comments or questions for our speakers in the chat. I now want to turn the program over to Caldwell Hart, who is a partner with New Dominion Consulting. And Caldwell, I would like you to give us a little bit about your background, and then Tim, when it's your turn, if you could do the same thing so our audience knows a little bit more about you.
Thanks, Kathy. That's a great segue. And welcome to today's really, I think, timely and important topic, risk, stress, and resiliency, to which we're going to give you an introduction to this concept of supply chain stress testing and how it's used to design more resilient supply chains. A little bit about myself. I'm a 25-year plus supply chain leader. So I have been in the roles across multiple industries, a former chief procurement officer and a head of supply chain. I'm also certified through ISM with my CPSM and my CPSD. I'm also currently an ISM course instructor, content developer, and a conference speaker. I'm passionate about this topic and really happy to have an opportunity to speak to you about it today. And I'm joined by our partner, Tim Murphy. I'd like, Tim, go ahead and introduce yourself for a second.
Sure. My name's Tim Murphy. I am, for better or for worse, a career consultant. So I like to tell people I've never worked an honest day in my life. I'm happy to be here and be part of this. Thank you for everyone who's joined us. I think this is a really exciting topic and a really interesting area of supply chain management that Caldwell's going to talk about.
Great. Thanks, Tim. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground today. We will go in a little bit more depth. I just want to give you guys a sense of where our focus areas are. And then we're going to delve into achieving business resilience, what risk, stress testing, and disruptions mean, the designing for resilience process, our model and approach. And then we want to leave time at the end to have a conversation, to hear your questions, also get feedback on our points and our message to see if it's resonating with the challenges you all are facing today. A little bit about New Dominion. I mean, most of us, as Tim said and I introduced, we're practitioners. We've been supporting supply chain and procurement operations at corporations and for clients for several decades. We've developed a focus on a number of core offerings that look at taking proven tool sets and applying them in innovative ways to help our clients achieve impact and excellence in business resilience, revenue, and profitability. First and foremost on that list is an area that I'm speaking about today, which is one of my passion areas, which is this concept of supply chain stress testing and how it impacts business resilience and the ability of companies to perform and continue to drive revenue. So what does achieving business resilience really mean? Well, it requires a focus and an application of complementary tool sets. We believe supply chain stress testing forms a foundation of that process to design for resiliency. I found these two quotations, which I really liked, because I think they're at the heart of what stress testing and designing for resiliency really is. Sun Tzu in The Art of War said, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. So at the core of his message is knowledge and self-awareness. And then General Colin Powell spoke about there are no secrets to being successful. It's the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. So preparation and learning. So while there are many disciplines that we can pull upon to help drive business resilience, like supplier diversification, cost and value engineering, and core procurement transformation, and people transformations and culture transformations, one of the most important elements, in some ways, I think the first step in the whole process, is this concept of supply chain stress testing. So I'd pose a question to the community, which is, which of these disruptions or risks poses the greatest risk to business continuity? Is it a natural disaster? Is it labor? relations, labor capacity, politics, public health, access to raw materials or natural resources? Is it an operational element, inventory, capacity, time, CapEx? Is it IT infrastructures or vulnerability to cyber attack? Is it an economic factor? Could be currency, core economics, financial performance. Is it a conflict? Is it a transportation logistics challenge? Access to transportation logistics, distances, capacity in your T&L network? Or is it an environmental and climate element? Or is there a regulatory, legal, or compliance disruption or impact? Which is the biggest risk or potential disruption? The answer to that is it might be all, or it might be some, or a combination of factors. But where should you focus your efforts? And where should your resources be focused to try to manage through this very complicated world that we live in? If I take a minute to pause and go traditionally where risk management has focused, risk and managing risk isn't necessarily new to many of us in supply chain management who've been leading these organizations for a number of years. So to answer where should effort be focused, many companies have traditionally relied on risk management. Risk management sought to answer questions of which risks might have the biggest impact or have the highest probability of failure. We use tools like heat maps and rankings to try to understand which risks might affect an individual supplier or a category the most, and what supplier performance might be affected by that risk. And we sought to rank them. And like a Pareto analysis, often it led to focused mitigation or reactive plans that really addressed maybe the top suppliers based on a traditional category management strategy. Which suppliers have the most spend, or which suppliers have the parts or goods or services that might impact us the most. It might perhaps be focused on an overall category strategy and the risks within that strategy. But most often than not, it really focused on putting systems and things in place that looked at early warning, monitoring of suppliers, and really typically keyed in on primarily tier 1 suppliers or a subsection of tier 1. It became more difficult as it started to look out into other tiers of the supply chain. While some risks might influence category or sourcing strategy, again, the end result of these things were often really short-term plans. Something to be initiated only if and when a specific event or type of event or risk was detected. It often also sometimes took the form of having a business continuity plan in place, which often feels very static. Our view of supply chain stress testing and designing for resilience is that this is a robust process based on developing comprehensive scenarios to test how a supply chain will react under duress based on combinations of factors. The stress test really offers us knowledge and insight by identifying potential points of failure, vulnerabilities, risks, and opportunities. Armed with that information, we can take action to develop more precise containment and mitigation playbooks in the near term, and really developing longer-term solutions by revising the design of our supply chains and the suppliers that we engage with to ensure long-term resiliency. Remember, resiliency is ensuring that the supply chain continues to perform to expectations regardless of the type, duration, and time of a risk or a disruption. In the words of Sun Tzu and Colin Powell from my first introduction to the topic, this process is about knowledge, self-awareness, learning, and ultimately preparation. So stress testing is a first step In the 2022 economic report from the president, I like the way they defined resilience. It's defined as the ability of supply chains to recover quickly from unexpected events. That word unexpected is really important to the message. Stress testing is seeking to remove the notion of what is unexpected and replacing it with what we can expect. So by creating these scenarios based on multiple factors, ensuring we align them to corporate goals and objectives, we can then perform a test in a controlled environment, much like a lab. So in the safety of a controlled environment, we can begin to test assumptions. We can begin to see, based on combinations of factors, what the expected or potential outcome might be. Then the stress test analyzes those results, identifies key factors. We can begin to do root cause, understand the largest impacts, and really find the drivers that will affect our supply chain, our supply system, and ultimately what our performance is going to be, so that we can be smarter in how we rebuild, redesign, adjust, and fix things so that we're more durable and more resilient. And we're able to make sure the system can react to various conditions seamlessly or eliminate the impacts of those conditions. The importance of stress testing, I like this quotation from Eli Goldratt, the author of The Goal. Good luck is when opportunity meets preparation, while bad luck is when lack of preparation meets reality. You know, after the 2008 financial crisis, the banking industry and regulators implemented stress testing to identify issues and impacts before the next crisis occurred. Why? So that they could prevent the next crisis, or at least mute impacts of events that might occur within that financial industry. This is the same concept that we're discussing here for supply chains and for our companies. Stress testing ultimately prepares an organization by illustrating what may happen. Again, the key drivers, the system deficiencies, and the potential impacts. We take that information and it allows the organization to develop an alternate outcome. With the frequency of events today, the range of risk factors, and the severity that we see, it demonstrates that relying on traditional monitoring, supplier relationship management, and traditional risk management is really insufficient. You know, while the COVID pandemic might be the first crisis that comes to people's minds, this map tries to illustrate over the last several years, really the last decade, just the number of items and disruptive events that have occurred that have impacted companies and their ability to perform. Most recently, we've had the Red Sea attacks with the Houthi rebels. That came on top of the drought in Panama that's caused transportation capacity issues in terms of flow of goods through the Panama Canal. The Red Sea attacks with the Houthi rebels is affecting the flow of ocean freight through the Suez Canal. That affects the flow of goods from places like Asia to Europe. It affects the flow of goods to the US. We already had issues in terms of port strikes and port capacity in places like Long Beach. If you wanted to defer that to a different port like Houston or Mobile, Alabama, or somewhere on the East Coast, you're typically going through Panama. Well, now Panama has got its own capacity issues. We've seen different political things like Brexit. We've seen natural disasters like wildfires, volcanoes in Iceland disrupting air freight. We've seen political issues, socioeconomic, quite a large range. I think it's also important to note the pandemic wasn't the first public health issue that we've potentially had to deal with. I can remember 2009 when H1N1 first hit the news. It had begun in Mexico, had come to the United States, had made its way to mainland and into Hong Kong, and was starting to affect labor capacity in various regions. If someone like myself, who had just developed a number of suppliers in Mexico, all of a sudden we're thinking the border might be shut down because of this H1N1, what does that mean to our supply chain and our ability to react and be flexible? If the events were limited to one or two finite item factors, they might be manageable. However, the reality we see today is that disruption is often complex, compounding, and is never relegated to just one tier. So if you look at your supply chain, it's not just tier one. That's us in the center. That's your company. That's your organization. And tier one might be tens to hundreds of suppliers, but you've got a handle on sort of who your top ones and maybe who the most critical ones are. But each supplier may potentially have more than one site that supplies you. And each of those sites will have their suppliers that supply the goods and services to operate their businesses. And so as you begin to look and migrate across the breadth and types of suppliers and begin to dig deeper across each tier, going into tier 2, tier 3, and ultimately what we call tier N, ultimately you could be looking at an ecosystem that is looking at thousands of suppliers. You then consider the kinds of disruptions we've had to face, the various risks that we try to get our arms around, and this challenge, again, becomes a compounding challenge. Stress testing looks to be able to take, again, a multi-tiered view and a multi-factored view to be able to evaluate variables at multiple levels. Why? Because the reality and the real challenge may actually be somewhere that's not directly visible to you. And so just monitoring a number of suppliers and waiting for that early warning alone is not enough in our estimation to be able to truly get your arms around how the supply chain may react or perform when subject to one of these disruptions or one of these risk factors. So again, the other piece is that traditional risk may also focus on sort of near-term plans that address a symptom rather than getting into where the real risk or real challenge or real disruption may occur and ultimately how durable and how you're going to be able to perform. So as I said, it's not just a single factor, it's a combination of factors. So what I'm illustrating here is that we build out scenarios that begin to put together combinations of these factors and position our organization so that we can gather important information, that knowledge and self-awareness we were talking about, to allow us to know what we can expect or should expect under certain conditions. This supports the development of those better outcomes rather than risking the repeating of the past. Why? Because learning from history, we've taught ourselves that's never a singular event or a single risk factor that impacts our operations and our ability to perform. It's combinations. So taking those original 12 elements, we can mix and match based on the context of our business, based on our knowledge of what we may be monitoring, past disruptive events that may have affected us, our corporate goals and objectives. And we can begin to put together combinations of these factors, run a scenario around it, and then analyze what the results were. As I said, this is a discipline. This is a process-based approach, and the stress testing element, developing those scenarios, is really the first step in this process of designing for resiliency. So we look at, again, historically, the different types of disruptive events, whether they affected us or not. Maybe something has changed and one of these things that affected other companies might affect us in the future. Maybe we didn't have direct knowledge of that. But we look at these things, we look at risk, we look at the complexity of the supply chain, develop the teams, develop the scenarios, conduct those tests, that lab controlled environment I was speaking about, do the analysis, identify the risks and opportunities, and through that detailed work, we're able to lead to insight. And the goal is not to stop. I think it's important to note in this process, it doesn't stop once we identify the risks and opportunities, those points of failure, the vulnerabilities, the gaps in our system. If that's all we're going to do, I mean, you might get some learning from that, but that's really only part of this overall cycle. It's important to move to action, to look at playbooks in the near term to mitigate and contain these issues, to improve them so they're more precise. You might already have some basic plans in place. This process will help them be even more precise and have better results on the containment and the mitigating. And then ultimately, the longer term focus is that design for resilient stage, to really develop transformative solutions that address the highest combination of impacts and risks. It may require mapping new relationships. It most certainly will probably require partnering with, engaging, collaborating. I cannot understate the fact that this is an iterative process. If we want to break the cycle of crisis management, making this process a core discipline with continual meaningful evaluation and engagement across not just tier 1, but working with your tier 2 and tier 3, and even potentially deeper into tier N, and then starting all over again on a regular cycle. So first and foremost, this process is about improving the durability of our supply chains. And to do so, I'm going to say it again, it requires a disciplined process. This is not an ad hoc reaction to current events. It's not a breaking case, in case of emergency, and we're just going to do these quick things. And great, we got through this. We can move on to the next one, or everything's fine, we're good, nothing more to do. That is not what this process is. This is a cyclical process. It's a methodical process. Why do we do it? Because we want to support agility. We want sustained operational performance. We want to promote that awareness, that self-awareness, and that knowledge. The process ensures supply chain continues to perform despite the certainty that disruptive events will occur. It's certain something's going to happen. We may not know exactly what it's going to be, but we can certainly follow a process like this to take chance out of the equation. So designing for resiliency, in our estimation, is a choice. I want to say that again. It's a choice that will improve your results versus a lucky outcome that happened by getting lucky and by chance. There are success stories following a process like this. I was fortunate enough to lead a team that had been evaluating a range of these factors, including things like sole source, the impact of natural disasters, geographies, in other words, concentrations of certain suppliers in certain categories for our key operations and products, the impact of socioeconomic, political, and even public health impacts. We've been learning from things that we'd seen over the previous few years. We had experience with factors like H1N1 and regional challenges like tariffs and regulations, access to labor. For instance, Chinese New Year, you've got to plan well ahead because you're not going to have any material coming out of your Asian plants for a good portion of February. It can take weeks to get back to capacity. So we'd already understood some of the impacts of access to labor and things like port capacity, those kinds of things. We've been evaluating how these factors might impact us and our ability to scale, meet fluctuating customer demand, and also address market trends amongst our customers as well as our products. By proactively evaluating a combination of these factors, we were able to determine where the greatest risk might come from, and we began to initiate a set of prioritized projects to design resiliency into our supply chain. That testing of assumptions and that planning put us in a stronger position to manage the early phases of the COVID crisis. Simple terms, our operation improved to be more resilient. One example of that plan is we had already begun to implement alternative sources. We had begun to flex alternative capacity, both in some of our own facilities as well across some of our suppliers. And we'd also gotten much smarter on some of our raw material, WIP, and finished goods inventory strategies. The result, our customers were more satisfied. We protected revenue and met our goals and commitments for the following quarters. and we had differentiated ourselves as a preferred business partner of choice for our customers.
Hey, Caldwell,
Again, yes,
can I
go
look,
ahead, Tim.
can I weigh in on this for a second? So I
Absolutely.
just wanted to share with everyone, when we were developing this concept and this offering at New Dominion, this was the aha moment for me. So I liked you. We had some conversations about what is resiliency? How do we conceptualize resiliency as a firm? And there were, the way we saw the world is a lot of people were repurposing risk management, as Caldwell has mentioned kind of early in this presentation. And we didn't think that quite hit the nail on the head. And Caldwell started sharing this process with me, and we were talking about it. What I liked about it was you kind of start with a series of scenarios and you test those scenarios, and it drives these two outcomes. It drives the short-term mitigation with the playbooks, and then it drives the long-term resiliency through improved supply chain design. But when we got to this example, this is where it all opened up for me, and it was this shockingly on the nose situation where H1N1 happened. Caldwell and his team had developed playbooks, had run scenarios around H1N1, had developed playbooks to address H1N1 if it came back, and if it was worse, and if it was a little bit different, so on and so forth. And then the pandemic hits, and they pull these playbooks off the shelf, and with very little adaptation, run the playbook. And the result was that and I don't know if we have it on this slide, but they met their financial goals in each quarter of 2020, which is insane. I mean, that's an incredible outcome for a company, and for a company that was, as he was at the time, as dependent as they were on their supply chain. So I just wanted to bring that spotlight to this story, because this was the one for me that the lights came on.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate that. And the other thing I would add is this isn't some theoretical consultant has dreamt up. I want to go back to my background. I was a supply chain leader and a chief procurement officer for a number of years. My teams lived the good, the bad, and the ugly of risk management all the way through and trying to work on these. And so developing this foundational element, stress testing, and then this view of designing for resiliency is something that I can proudly say I've spent a portion of my career trying to putting into practice in our organizations. It works. We also believe there is a maturity model to it. You don't have to be perfect in everything today to be able to start somewhere within this. So good is beginning with a basic set of scenarios. You might look at a subsection of your top products and services, an initial view of key tier 1 suppliers, and rather than trying to create scenarios that address 50 different risk or disruptive factors, start somewhere. 3 to 5 can be evaluated. It's a cycle. You can build on that foundation and get better in more complex scenarios, looking at a broader group of products or services, digging deeper into your supply chain, tier 1 and some of the key tier 2s, maybe even tier 3 and beyond. And then also how this begins to integrate with other processes at the company, like enterprise risk management, other groups like quality, finance, within your own teams, category management, your sourcing processes. This process shouldn't be done in a silo. It should bring in cross-functional groups to look at it. Each group may have a different perspective. They have information, they have knowledge, they have experience. All of that can be vital in terms of designing these scenarios and testing them. And I want to strongly say, in the best practice, obviously, when you get to that level of maturity, it's the broadest range of scenarios, a very comprehensive list of factor profiles, all business critical products and services, a real detailed view of tier N, and cooperative testing with your supply chain partners. And before I move on, I'm going to touch on that in a little more depth. Suppliers represent a lot of unknowns for us, particularly if you go back to my bullseye as you start to go through the layers of the supply chain. How confident are you today that your tier one suppliers have processes and have a view on traditional risk, let alone this sense of durability and testing various disruptions? Are they reactive or are they proactive? Do they have the ability to evaluate their business and understand the impacts, not just on them, but what the impact is on their customers like you? And this is more than just asking them for business continuity plans. This most robust best practice is really about collaborating directly and integrating them into your stress testing and designing process. It's also about educating them and teaching them so they can take it into their tier two, their tier three. Why? Because that's at the core of eliminating unexpected events, not knowing what the potential impacts might be, and being surprised versus being prepared. So near term, as we were just talking about, near term is really about containing and mitigating. You use those stress tests to really analyze and identify really right in front of your face kind of gaps, trends, vulnerabilities, as well as opportunities. You might begin to do some of that basic root cause analysis. So you're starting to get to some of the real causes, not just having a mitigating plan that addresses a symptom. And you do some alignment. You begin to rank those impacts. The real outcome is developing the near-term playbooks. These are really more those short-term mitigating that if this situation presents itself, here's who's accountable for what and what we're going to do. Of course, you implement and then you monitor. But whether you're staying in the near term with the mitigating playbooks, retest. This is not a once in a decade process. And I say that over and over again. This is a disciplined process that repeats itself. And then the longer term, really the future, it's really a much more comprehensive, in-depth endeavor from the analytical phase through the quantification phase, and really this third one, which is really developing the solutions, the long-term solutions to reduce or to the level that you're able to eliminate potential negative impacts. It requires a lot of partnership with suppliers and stakeholders and others. It also requires knowing and understanding what it's going to take to implement those plans, the budgets and the metrics. That cannot be understated. If you've got to go out and qualify a new supplier to eliminate a risk because you've identified something through the stress test, that might require supplier development resources. It might require CapEx. Maybe it's money to invest in new patterns, to move foundries or qualify an additional foundry, which means duplicate patterns. Where are those patterns located? That could, again, it could be CapEx. It could be investing in capacity, training for labor. It could be any number of things. So that develop solutions phase is really the biggest difference between the short, near term, which is around containment mitigation, and really designing a more robust, more durable future through resiliency. And then, as I've said before, the aligning and prioritizing, and then you implement and you monitor. And like any good system, plan, do, check, act. You get through this, you learn, you implement it, you run your stress tests again, and you retest. And you do that on a regular basis. And that brings us really to the end of our prepared comments. We'd love to open it up now to questions, comments, feedback. Are we on point with the message? What I read on a daily basis of the disruptions when lots of people are talking about, I think resilience, whether it's the current administration or our C-suites, our stakeholders, I think it's an important topic. I think we have a great solution and a viewpoint of how you can begin to address it. So Kathy, we'll turn it over to the chat to see what kind of questions are coming up. and if we can answer them.
Okay, we have no questions at this point, but please put your questions in our chat. If for some reason you would like to, ask your question live, just raise your hand and then we'll give you the option to ask your question live. But please, it's an important topic, so let us get your comments or questions for our speakers.
Hey, Kathy, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I have a question for the group. When you think of your supply chain, what's the animal you best think of to represent your ideal supply chain?
I know what Tim's going to say.
Come on, I know there's at least a few people out there. Put it in the chat. Just type the one word. What's the animal?
Oh, an octopus.
I love it. Great one. Okay, what else we got?
A chameleon, eagle.
Mike, I know you're out there. Put one in.
A marmot.
These are great. These are good.
Fast, fierce, sleek, able to duck and weave into the rocks. I like the marmot. They're fierce animals.
The marmot is survivable. You live above the tree line, high altitude, tough living. But and what I really like about this, so Marianne, I love the octopus. You have to be able to reach out. You have to be able to manage a lot of different things. The chameleon is very interesting. You have to be able to adapt it, speak to adaptability. The eagle, Angela, is tardigrade. I like it. You guys are taking this as similar. So the animal, the classic animal that people use is a cheetah. And especially pre-2020, people thought about cheetahs. And you want something that's fast, something that's agile, something that's sleek, something that's efficient, something that's deadly. I don't know. What are all the ways you describe a cheetah, right? And the question I often ask people is, instead of a cheetah, wouldn't you want a grizzly bear? And where a cheetah is agile, a grizzly bear is durable. And you think about a grizzly bear, it can run something like 40 miles an hour. It can travel great distances. They're almost impossible to kill. They can eat almost anything. They can live in a wide variety of climates, a little bit like Courtney's tardigrade. So you get into this question, and the reality is you need elements of both the cheetah and the grizzly in your supply chain. What Caldwell is putting forward here and presenting is, how do you introduce elements of that's fair, but if you were the grizzly, then your supply chain would be scaring off your competitors, right? But how do you bring elements of that grizzly or the tardigrade or the marmot or the octopus? How do you chameleon, eagle? How do you bring those elements into your supply chain and integrate them? And I think what Caldwell is speaking to here is an important tool of how do you bring those flexible, durable, adaptable elements into an existing supply chain. Absolutely. You become the animal. But there's an element to when you say become the animal. I think that's an interesting way to think about it, is there's a part of this, and this tool that Caldwell is presenting is a way to access it. But when you think about safety, employee health and safety, the answer to how do you improve your employee health and safety is very rarely process. You don't improve your EH&S through process, you improve it through culture. You change your culture. You become what you want to be, which is an organization that prioritizes safety. And I think that's the same thing we're talking about with the supply chain here. How do you change your supply chain? It's not so much about changing the process of your supply chain. How do you change the identity of a supply chain? How do you change the culture around your supply chain? And there's no one single answer to that. This can be part of that transformation.
The other thing I'd like to add is this notion of stress testing, particularly. We can get very complacent. I mean, I worked in organizations where we implemented the monitoring tools. There's many out there. I don't need to rattle off the SaaS solutions that will monitor risk. Some of them are even predictive. They'll tell you if a supplier has a chance of going out of business in a certain number of months based on things like paydex and operational changes in their management team, all of those kinds of things. But what I found those systems and even the best processes fell short on until we started to do this foundational stress testing is it's like the smoke detector at your house. It starts to go off, and what do you end up doing? Well, you keep getting alerts in your email from certain suppliers. Well, you start to ignore them. You take the batteries out of the smoke detector at home and open up the windows if you're burning something in the kitchen. Maybe you remember to put them back in, but I mean, we're all guilty of that, right? Yes, Angela, you shouldn't do that, but people do that. They begin to ignore it.
I have done that.
And I certainly have had category leaders who start to get a little, they get complacent. They've gotten some alerts. There was nothing really going on. It's not that, you know, you're crying wolf, but you sort of get numb to it. And when you look at that map I shared, I mean, my organizations were affected by every single item on that map. But you start to get numb in today's world. What used to be a black swan event once a quarter or twice a year is now like a weekly event. This stress testing is also a hedge against that complacency, because that process forces you to go back through and really test your assumptions to really make sure that you've got the right plans or the right designs in place to eliminate those vulnerabilities so that you're not at risk of complacency or even just turnover. Your team changes out. People get promoted, they leave. By doing this regularly, you're ensuring that you're keeping your strategy, your plans, and your ability to be durable, relevant, and current versus, like so many things, the business continuity plan that got put in the file cabinet and hasn't been updated in a decade. So we're still happy to take comments and questions. Thanks for the prompt on the animals, Tim.
Yeah, that was great. We did get one comment in. It seems like the process of stress testing and resilience planning would be great for driving formal contracts for current suppliers without such contracts. What are your comments about that?
Absolutely. I think that's a great extension of this. We began to do that in a prior life by putting things into both our qualification process for suppliers as well as contracts of being able to ask them both for data information and part of the mitigating playbook, a little bit more nearer term. Do they have business continuity plans? And part of our QBRs, I'll add that you could, if you're going to require a QBR or have QBRs, you integrate processes like this into that QBR process. You ask those questions in the controlled environment of what and how they might react to certain things so that you can understand where the risks and what disruptions might affect those suppliers in your QBRs before something happens. And then what? You're scrambling and you're in crisis management. So yes, I think those are great comment. And yes, you can absolutely begin to integrate it in. As I mentioned, you can integrate it into your category management, your strategic sourcing, contracts. It has an element in all of those kinds of things.
Yeah. And then we have another comment. Another key is buy-in from C-suite. They must believe these initiatives to be a priority, if not a core competency.
I will agree. And that's why I mentioned the importance of building that cross-functional team to look at it and integrating it into things like the company's enterprise risk management process. You can certainly begin it within the supply chain team. No one you shouldn't wait for C-suite, at least in my experience. Don't wait for somebody to tell you it's okay to do it or for their support, because I can certainly tell you what crisis management looks like when the CEO calls and says, what's going to happen? They just shut the border and we're not going to get anything out from Asia into our US factories. They don't want to hear, well, I could have done this, but I didn't get your support. I mean, at least in the roles I had as chief procurement officer, it was my job to be proactive and begin to do these things without asking permission. But yes, the C-suite, I was lucky when I was in oil and gas. We had a great enterprise risk management process. It always included, because we've been partnering and collaborating with them, questions about supply chain risk. And it was out of that process that we began to actually get board level visibility to this kind of view of risk and impact of disruption and how we were working to mitigate and eliminate it. And it became part of our core plan to answer questions and accountability that came out of the annual ERM questionnaires. So that is another way to do it. And that's a great place to start. If your company has someone in charge of that ERM process, start to talk with them. You can also talk to the head of sales. If you can't generate sales, there's not much that you guys are, a company's going to be doing. So that's another great place.
I think that's an interesting point, Caldwell, and I think it goes along with the C-suite question here. We see business continuity as an unbreakable chain. Supply chain continuity drives operational continuity, which enables sales continuity. And you can't break the chain. You can't have sales continuity with operational continuity. Can't have operational continuity without supply chain continuity. So I think in getting that buy-in from the C-suite and in helping them to understand this importance is to help them understand those links. That, they'll say, I've heard executives in the C-suite talk about sales is a strategic issue, supply chain is a tactical issue. Can't be. You can't fulfill your sales if your supply chain isn't intact. And I think what we're talking about here is a way to ensure you're able to fulfill those sales. So this is the sales question. This is a profitability question. This is a client service, customer service question.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned the word profitability. I'm going to make a comment around profitability. In our initial slide, we didn't necessarily have the circle on profitability checked off, tying to stress testing and designing for resiliency. I think we could, because in my experience, you can save a lot of time on expediting the hours and resources managing global crisis and the amount of money divulged to that. And again, back to expediting, it's not just the expediter making those calls every single day and holding up someone, the supplier, but then to get your material out or to get parts or whatever it might be, you're paying overcharges. Maybe you're having to get air freight where it used to come 3 weeks ocean, but now your whole supply chain is reacting and the cost is adding up. That absolutely impacts margin and profitability more so than maybe if we were smarter and designed something different or developed a closer supplier. Maybe had not huge amounts of buffer stock or buffer inventory, but a smarter view on certain inventory amounts, those kinds of things.
Mary Ann made a great comment here. She said the supply chain capability is similar to IP or brand because it has value. It needs to be recognized as a value so that the C-suite will pay attention to it. And that's a wonderful, wonderful contribution. And when you think about it, how do you view a software license as an intangible asset, but a functioning supply chain? You look at a functioning supply chain, you don't see an intangible asset. It's one of your greatest intangible assets.
Yeah. Also need to recognize that labor machines that build machines also should receive competent resilience analysis and scenario plan. Completely agree. In fact, I know a fantastic supplier in the Boston area in the semiconductor world, who I won't say he was a tier 1 in one of my prior companies. I won't necessarily say he had a really robust stress testing process, but he'd certainly regularly evaluated the risks to his ability to meet his obligations, to flex his capacity. It's an industry that can go, 100 units a month and then go to 10,000 overnight. It also had a lot of variability and turnover in the labor pool and a limited access. He identified it as one of his core risks, and he's now recognized as having built the old-fashioned apprentice programs. He has a pipeline to all the VOTEC schools in the Boston area. He's a steady pipeline of talent that comes in and gets trained in lean manufacturing so that he can flex, never is down for labor issues. And it's helped him survive what came out of an employment phase where, that was one of the biggest issues to rebounding was people couldn't fill the jobs. They'd have 100 spots open at a factory and they were able to fill 10. 5 people would show up and 5 would fail their drug test. That's an actual story from one of our suppliers. You're still 95 behind. He understood that as a gap and a risk to his business and his ability. And so he's differentiated himself and addressed that. So yeah, machines, you could add more factors to that slide I showed on the 12. That's definitely one of them. Labor, machines. Right now in semiconductor, they can't get chips, which are required to go on the boards that go in the machines to make the chips. It's sort of a circular doom loop. So yes, that would be part of an analysis like this potentially. It doesn't just have to be supply chain view. You could turn this introspectively and design a stress test with your risk management team in the ERM and look at broad risk, this being one part of it, and build stress tests. In fact, my first exposure to stress testing was in the financial services industry, right out of undergrad, in running semi-annual stress tests to see how we would react in a major disruptive event or series of events.
We got another comment in. This kind of education for distributed enterprises is paramount. They need to know that this subject matter is way beyond inventory management, especially for manufacturers of high-tech equipment, which can have BOMs
Bombs.
with bombs with 5,000 SKUs.
Absolutely. I think what you're touching on, and I worked in some industries where the bomb was like 60,000 parts. I mean, I worked in aerospace. A jet engine has roughly 60,000 parts. And I think it's one
But
of
if you work for Boeing, you don't need as many bolts as you think you might.
Let's not go there. But
No, let's not go there.
Yeah, but 5,000 SKUs or 60,000. I think this is where some of the traditional ways like category management is presented in terms of, segmenting your suppliers can sometimes lead us in the wrong direction, or as back to our conversation here, might not identify a risk. The risk might be in a transactional supplier that you're just getting run-of-the-mill gaskets or something that isn't highly technical. It meets a spec, but it's not something that's highly designed, highly engineered. But that, that old $1 O-ring might be the difference between you making production and keeping your line open or down. Well, what if the marketplace is consolidated and you now got one single source O-ring manufacturer, or you're getting it from a distributor, but they're not managing their portfolio very well, and it's in tier 2, and it's halfway across the world, and that's a high risk because of these other factors. So that wouldn't necessarily show up in your strategic segment, but the stress testing would aim to identify those kinds of gaps. So yeah, the more complicated the BOM and the service, absolutely.
And one of the things that brings up is earlier in the presentation, Caldwell had a chart with concentric circles of suppliers on it. And I think that's a key element to think about is lots of folks who we talk to about this topic, they think about their tier 1, and we often talk about that as looking at your supply chain as though it's flat. And it's right there in front of you, and you can put it up on a board. And the reality is when you turn it sideways, it extends out. And if your tier 1 can be as solid as as possible and could be diversified and managing risk and working on resiliency. But if their tier ones or their tier twos go down, it doesn't matter how good your tier one is. And that's why it's important when you think about this kind of stress testing to think about how many levels back you need to go.
Well, and I think that brings up the old cliche, trust but verify. Your tier one could say they have everything under control. Stress testing and the scenario planning and integrating them into your process is a way to verify and test that statement. I like this comment that there are other industries, the food industry with spoilage concerns. Absolutely. I would actually say spoilage applies to lots of industries. Those of you that work in industries that consume a lot of industrial supplies, consumables, everything from glue to batteries to lubricants to 10W40 motor oil has expiration dates. And if you're working on a piece of high-tech equipment, that could be your machine tool, or it could be a lubricant that's used in your end product. How is your inventory management set up? How are you ensuring that bad materials that are expired are removed from the process, disposed of properly, can't get into the system? I mean, there's risk elements to that. You could have scenarios around those kinds of things.
But yeah, whoever wrote this up, I think that's actually Mike. You think about food, it's such a wonderful example. You think about how many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars you can lose in a food distribution operation or a food processing operation because you don't, your logistics chain, your outbound logistics is down or interrupted, or you can't get a part for a food processing machine. And if your inventory sits, it spoils. And it spoils very, very quickly in some cases. So this is all about uptime. It's all about that continuity. How do you keep your continuity intact?